2023 has been a wild ride for superhero movies. From the end of the DCEU to a brand new phase of the MCU, this year has been filled with milestones both good and bad for comic book movies. Today I'm going to be ranking all 9 comic book movies that came out this year. Before I get into my ranking, let me know your ranking for all 9 of these films in the comments down below. But without wasting any more time, let's get into it. Starting off the list in 9th place for me is Shazam! Fury of the Gods. When this film originally came out, I actually liked it a lot, but upon rewatch and just sitting with it more, this film basically takes everything I loved about the first Shazam movie and then does none of it, introduces a bunch more lore, but never makes anything as interesting or fun as the first movie. I'd be lying if I said the action wasn't really interesting, and my biggest praise for the DC Extended Universe, which I ranked recently, you can check out, link in the description down below, is that everything feels like it's straight off of a comic book page. This movie feels like that, but aside from that, I didn't really gain much from it. I think all of the charm and charisma from the first movie is diluted down here. I do like the new additions. I like Jack Dylan Grazer. I think that's his name. I like him, and he has a lot more time in this movie than he did in the first movie. At least it feels like that. Rachel Zegler is also another standout, and on top of that, all the older versions of the Shazam family, except for Zachary Levi, they all do a pretty good job with the very mediocre, average, and just in general lackluster script that they were given. In 8th place for me is The Marvels. Though this is low on the list, I think this is a pretty big jump from Shazam! Fury of the Gods. I think the biggest problem with The Marvels lies where the problem of Captain Marvel came in, which is the protagonist herself isn't too interesting, and I think, again, somehow they made Captain Marvel boring in this movie and less interesting than she was in Endgame, where she had minimal screen time. But aside from that, I think the pros of this movie are really high. I think visually it is a little bit still on that muddy MCU side of it, but I think the cast makes up for it. I think Carol Danvers is an interesting enough character, but when paired up with Miss Marvel and Photon, I think Iman Vellani is an amazing addition to the MCU and works so well in this team aspect, and I think just she carries the hell out of this film. My biggest thing is this just feels like an average MCU movie, and to me that is pretty fun. I actually had a great time with this movie, but it's just very generic and sometimes forgettable. I think the villain of this film is one of the most forgettable in the entire MCU, just flat out boring. But again, I think this movie is a lot of fun. I think Carol Danvers could use some more work character-wise, but Miss Marvel and Photon are on their way up as some of the most fun MCU characters, and this one is a general win for a solo movie, but once again just lacks the urgency that I've wanted recent Marvel movies to have. In 7th place, we have Ant-Man and the Wasp: Quantumania. Easily one of the most disappointing movies of the year. This is one of my most anticipated films of the year, one of my most anticipated comic book movies for a very long time, and I went in expecting so much, and I was so disappointed by this film, and that's coming from someone that generally really enjoys the Ant-Man films. I think the first Ant-Man movie is one of the most underrated comic book movies in general. I think Ant-Man and the Wasp is fine. I don't think it's as bad as everyone puts it out there to be, but Quantumania, though it isn't straight up bad, it is just sadly mediocre, and it had so much gunning for it, in my personal opinion at least. It was supposed to be that like launching point for Kang, the next big bad, which obviously we don't know what direction they're going in now with all the Jonathan Majors drama, but at the time of this movie coming out, none of that really existed, and so we kind of got this very lackluster what felt to be like a throwaway villain for someone that was supposed to be our big bad. And on top of that, this movie takes place almost exclusively in the quantum realm, yet it doesn't look amazing. Again, I can cut them some slack because they're taking place of the whole movie in a separate universe. I think that in itself is pretty cool. But I think Quantumania, where it lacks, is just, it lacks urgency. And that's what we need when you're fighting a variant, at least, of the big bad of the future of the MCU. And again, that's where this movie just completely falls apart. I think Paul Rudd still has great charisma. I think the Ant-Man family works really well together. It's not a bad story. It's just executed very poorly. Moving up the list in 6th place for me is The Flash. This is the DCEU's kind of reboot, but Aquaman The Lost Kingdom still came out after it. Don't really know what's going on in terms of timeline stuff, but this movie in and of itself is very frustrating to me because on the con side of it, this is an absolute disgrace to just in general artists, I guess you could say. This movie looks atrocious at times, but I'm also kind of conflicted because some of the like comic booky moments of him slowly running through time, also just speed running, all of those things feel like they're ripped out of a comic book page, and it's so sick. But at other times, this film just feels so lifeless. It's a disgrace to the art form, in my opinion, sometimes. You know, those full CGI things that they do at the end of the movie, I'm not a fan of that. I think conceptually it's actually really cool. And honestly, my pros for this movie come in on the conceptual end, if that makes sense. I think thematically, this film feels like perfect for what The Flash is supposed to be. But on the other end, I feel like it does so much conceptually of this thing with the Dark Flash and then multiple Barry Allens, Michael Keaton returning as Batman, Ben Affleck Batman being here as well. There's so much that feels like it should be working in this filled up DC extended universe. But it all falls flat because you can't bear to look at so many of these visuals. There's stuff that is straight up just ugly. Everything just like, it doesn't look good at all. There's no excuse for it. And I feel like the only excuse for it is that this is like the Frankenstein baby of what Warner Brothers Discovery, the Zack Snyder problems, the Ezra Miller drama, everything that happened led to this movie. And that's okay. I mean, this movie is going to be forgotten about in a few years, but I do want to give it its flowers just in terms of, yes, it is heartfelt in my opinion. I think there's a core of a story that needed to be told here, and I think Flash was a great vessel for that story, but sadly it was delivered in a way that makes it look stupid, silly, and goofy, in a way that the story that is thematically rich can't be taken seriously because the craft of it was just off. Moving into my top 5 comic book movies of the year, in 5th place for me is Blue Beetle. I mean, for a streaming movie, this one is really great. I can't believe it actually got released in theaters, and it looks great on the big screen. It is easily the best looking DC movie that has come out this year, and it's crazy that it was originally meant to be put on Max. I really love what they do with a big chunk of this movie, but my biggest problem obviously falls in with the villain here. She is very, very generic. She feels like the lazily written, just rich mob lady that has all of these tools at her disposal. That's all that it is, and at times it is annoying, but at times every other aspect kind of makes up for it. I love the family aspects of this movie. I think Xolo Maridueña needs to come back in the DCU in some capacity because he is such a great talent for Blue Beetle, and I think the supporting cast is really, really fun. Even the actress who plays the villain isn't the worst in the world. I just think the story that they chose on the villainous side of things doesn't really work. But again, on every other aspect, I think this movie actually excels. I think the Blue Beetle suit is absolutely amazing, one of my favorite comic book suits of all time. I think visually this movie is really, really great. Honestly, again, it feels like a comic book brought to life. That's what all of these DC movies feel like. But this one, I will say, visually, it does the job. Again, not as like far-fetched and crazy as The Flash, Aquaman, The Lost Kingdom. It doesn't go like with balls to the wall with the visuals, but it is a grounded story, and the visuals work in that capacity of it, which I really, really enjoyed. But again, problems aside, I think a lot of this film works emotionally, thematically, just being a coming-of-age superhero movie. Blue Beetle is a lot of fun in my opinion. But in 4th place for me is Aquaman and the Lost Kingdom. This is the final comic book movie of 2023, and I really, really enjoyed this movie. I feel like it's just the first movie, but it expands all of the lore, all of the action, the heroes, the villains. It feels like a pretty good follow-up to the first film. I will say though, this barely edges out Blue Beetle. My biggest problem with Aquaman and Lost Kingdom is that visually, I think a lot of the underwater sequences look cool, like landscape-wise, but a lot of the face replacements and just like visual effects on like comping and stuff like that is pretty bad. The mixing of the live action and CGI world, it does not really work at all. But those gripes aside, my other big problem with this movie is how Black Manta was used. I feel like it's just not the same character from the first movie. He's raw as hell, he's badass as hell, but it doesn't feel like that story was truly transferred over, but I think it kind of works. Because in the grand scheme of things, I actually like the Lost Kingdom storyline. I like this thing about, you know, the 7th kingdom that was erased from existence. And I don't want to get into the nitty gritty of the details of the film because I didn't know much about the story going in, but I really, really like the elements that they took from the comic book with, you know, Arthur's bloodline with his brother and his son at this point. And I know there's a lot of controversy around Amber Heard right now. Don't want to get into that stuff, but I think Amber Heard is actually surprisingly good in this movie. movie. She's in it for a good chunk of time, and I think Mara works pretty well. She's written out of like the middle act of the film, but what she's in, she's pretty good. I think the story of family, brotherhood, fatherhood, everything blends together so well here. And it's just, you know what a movie f***s? That's what this movie is. It just straight up. It's so much fun. It's exhilarating. It's exciting. When a movie just kicks ass, you have so much fun in the theater. You're smiling, you're grinning. That's what Aquaman The Lost Kingdom did for me. I had a great time with this movie. Moving into my top 3 though, in third place for me is Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles Mutant Mayhem. I had such a great time with this movie. I got to watch this twice in theaters, and honestly, going in the first time, I wasn't really expecting much, to be honest with you. I thought it was a cool visual style, but I had stayed away from most of the trailers. I went in and I was delightfully surprised. This movie is so much fun. I think the transition between the second and third act is a little bit clobbery. I felt like the movie was supposed to end a couple of times, and then at the end I was like, damn, it's already over. It was a really weird pacing thing that was happening, but aside from that, as a Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles movie, this is so much fun. I had such a great time. All the voice actors are great. The kids feel like they truly have real chemistry. Now, I will say though, I don't know if this movie will age the best. I think that a lot of the humor is obviously designated to the time right now, this current humor, and that's funny and all, but I don't see myself in 3 years, 4 years, when I try to rewatch this movie, laughing at the same types of jokes. My only problem with this movie is the characterization of Splinter. I think he's cool. I just think he's a little bit too goofy, and I think it's fine, but it's a little bit odd when you compare it to other iterations of Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. But moving up the list, in second place for me is Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3. This is the conclusion to the Guardians series in the MCU, and James Gunn is back yet again delivering an amazing film. James Gunn in general is an absolute visionary in my opinion. He is one of the greatest creative minds in Hollywood in my opinion right now. I mean, obviously he specializes in comic book films, you know, superhero movies. He's taking on the DC universe. He's been a big, massive, honestly pretty key part of the MCU. Arguably the biggest key part right underneath Kevin Feige in my personal opinion. And Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3 proves that he is not just a hit or miss director. In my opinion, every single comic book film that he's made, whether it's with Marvel or DC, or even TV show for that matter, because Peacemaker also rips, he doesn't miss. In Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3, the stakes were as high as they've ever been. He's made 2 movies that were great. The Suicide Squad was an amazing DC film. Peacemaker was an amazing TV show. Now, how do you cap off this amazing series built within the MCU of these characters that, whether they die or live, we will get emotional about? He tells this story about Rocket the Raccoon surrounding him, and you get this just deeply distraught and devastating performance by Bradley Cooper in the lead role as Rocket, as well as all of these other amazing characters that we've loved over the last 10 years in the Guardians of the Galaxy. You get this story that absolutely breaks your heart. I'm gonna get into spoilers here because obviously most of us have seen the movie by now. The fact they kill off Rocket in the very beginning of the movie, and the whole, or at least 90% of this film, is trying to just get Rocket back alive. That is one of, honestly, the most ballsy choices I've seen in a big motion picture in a very long time. I was not expecting that at all. And the fact that he was able to make such a ballsy choice in the beginning of the film, but also just ride it out until the very, very end, I think it was an absolute brilliant move, and it makes this movie so unique. One of the best entries in the entire Marvel Cinematic Universe, and one of my favorite comic book movies of all time. But with that being said, my number 1 favorite comic book movie of 2023 is Spider-Man Across the Spider-Verse. Now, spoiler alert, you guys will see this in my top 10 movies of the year list as well, but Across the Spider-Verse absolutely shattered animation movie records, shattered just all expectations. No one expected the follow-up, at least I didn't expect, the follow-up to Into the Spider-Verse to be just as good, if not better, but this movie crushes it. I absolutely love what they do here. Miles Morales is evolved in an amazing way. The concept of the multiverse is evolved in an absolutely amazing way, and I think, obviously, you know, the use of live action and animated has also been a little bit weird of a conversation, but personally, I think it adds so much to this multiverse that they've already built that is so interesting. I really, really love the way that they've expanded all of these characters. This one is so different than the first in terms of just the storytelling itself, but it seems like the third will go back to that group storytelling. You know those movies, and I've talked about this before, where they just feel like sequences, not like a combined movie. When obviously you put them together, it becomes even more amazing. But when you're going through the movie, you think of it as scenes. You don't think about it as just like a big picture in itself. When I say this, personally, I think of movies like The Batman or Infinity War. And these two movies are some of the greatest comic book films of all time. And that's where Across the Spider-Verse stands, in my opinion. Maybe it's because I've seen it so many times back to back to back, but all these individual sequences feel like they live and breathe on their own. And the fact that I'm able to split this movie into chapters and still love it just as much, I feel like that says so much to just the craft of this film. But guys, that wraps up my ranking for all of the 2023 comic book movies. Again, let me know your ranking of all these movies in the comments down below. Thank you so much for watching. I'll see you next time. Peace.